Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're plunging into Anne Applebaum's Gulag, a history of the Soviet camps.
Hmm.
And this really isn't just about, barbed wire and frozen landscapes. It's a deep look at how this massive system of forced labor became just central to the Soviet Union and, well, the lives of millions.
It really did. Applebaum's book is incredibly comprehensive. It lays out how the Gulag wasn't static, It changed. It started with these early, maybe somewhat disorganized camps right after the revolution. Then it morphed into this, enormous industrial machine under Stalin. And even after Stalin died, it kept transforming.
So a lot of evolution there.
Definitely. Key themes are obviously the brutal conditions, but also things you might not expect, like complex social structures within the camps, the constant struggle just to survive day to day, and even surprising bits of resistance, pockets of culture. And finally, the book really stresses the long shadow it cast over, Soviet and then post-Soviet life.
Exactly. And for you listening, our goal in this deep dive is really to track that chronological story. We want to unpack some surprising details, get at the human stories inside this huge, pivotal history. Sort of a shortcut to understanding it all. So where does this story actually begin? Where does Applebaum kick it off?
It really kicks off right after the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks pretty quickly set up a network of camps. Applebaum details how they often just repurposed existing places, like old prisoner of war camps that were empty.
Using infrastructure. Makes sense.
Yeah. And what's interesting, or maybe surprising, in those very early days is that some prisoners, especially the political socialists, anarchists, people like that, they actually demanded certain rights. And sometimes they got them. Things that seem incredible now, like getting newspapers or, being allowed to move around relatively freely within the camp itself.
Wow. Not the image most of us have. Freedom of movement inside a camp.
It's jarring, isn't it? Solovetsky is a key example she uses for this early period. It was in an old monastery complex on islands in the White Sea. And while conditions were definitely harsh for, say, common criminals, the political prisoners there managed to create this kind of bubble of cultural life.
Like what kind of culture?
Well, things like theater groups putting on plays, they published journals, actual journals with, scholarly articles sometimes. And remarkably, religious practices continued. Applebaum mentions these quite grand Easter celebrations happening as late as 1926.
That's amazing. It shows this resilience, maybe. A need to hold on to something human.
Absolutely. It suggests it wasn't just about bare survival, but about keeping some sense of identity, of community, even in that environment, trying not to be totally dehumanized.
But I get the sense this relative freedom, if you can call it that, didn't stick around.
No, it didn't. And even early on, you see conflicts starting to brew, tensions arise. Camp bosses started complaining about certain groups. Applebaum quotes one complaining about white guards who feel themselves to be political prisoners. So you see the definitions tightening, the lines being drawn more sharply about who's really an enemy.
Okay, so the categories are already becoming more rigid. And wasn't there a key figure, Frankel, who really pushed Solovetsky in a different direction?
Yes, Naftali Frankel. His arrival was significant. He's credited, or maybe blamed, for introducing this system, often summed up as, you eat as you work.
The rationing system tied to labor output.
Exactly. That was a massive shift. It moved the primary purpose away from any even vague idea of re-education towards just raw economic exploitation. Your survival literally depended on how much work you could do. And this naturally crushed a lot of those earlier prisoner freedoms and initiatives.
So pretty quickly, things harden, the focus becomes purely exploitative. But Applebaum points out this system didn't just, appear from nothing, right? There were precedents.
Oh, definitely. She's clear that the Gulag had, you could say, echoes or roots in the Tsarist prison system. Siberian exile, katorga, wasn't just for murderers or thieves. Political dissidents, like the Decembrists back in the 19th century, were sent there too. So this idea of using remote exile and forced labor for political opponents wasn't entirely new. It laid some groundwork.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move into the next phase, the early to mid-1930s. Applebaum calls this the Great Turning Point. What changes then?
This is where Stalin's push for rapid industrialization completely changes the game. It creates this just enormous demand for labor, cheap labor, forced labor.
And the camps become the source for that later.
Pretty much the primary source. The whole focus shifts drastically from any lingering ideas about re-education to just exploiting prisoners economically. Any pretense is basically dropped.
And the secret police, the OGPU at this time, they step in to manage this.
Yes, the OGPU gains control over this huge, expanding pool of prisoners. And it's not just individual convicts anymore. It includes vast numbers of deported kulaks peasants labeled as wealthy exploiters who were designated as special exiles.
What did special exiles mean in practice?
It meant whole families, sometimes entire villages, forcibly relocated, often to very harsh regions. They were essentially forced laborers tied to specific settlements or projects, forbidden to leave. And at the same time, you see the courts handing out much harsher sentences for really minor crimes. Petty theft could land you in the camps for years.
So it's all about feeding the machine, getting more bodies into the system.
Exactly. It's about numbers to fulfill the labor quotas for these massive projects.
Right, this is when we see those huge, infamous projects starting. The White Sea Canal.
Bellemare Canal, yeah. Built largely on the Solovetsky or Eslan model. Also the early camps up in the Komi region, places like Ukta, Vorkuta for coal and oil. And of course, Kolyma-Dalstroy in the far northeast. Gold mining. Absolutely notorious.
And the conditions on these projects.
Appalling, just horrific. Applebaum documents the incredibly high death tolls, especially on the White Sea Canal. People dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, accidents, the cold. The new camps in Komi were often set up with almost no supplies, meaning prisoners arrived to basically nothing. Just wilderness and impossible work quotas.
It's hard to even imagine, and yet the state was putting out propaganda about this stuff.
Oh, intensely. Plays, films, books, posters, all glorifying projects like the White Sea Canal, presenting the camps as places where criminals were reforged into good Soviet citizens through heroic labor, completely masking the death and suffering. It's a chilling example of state narrative control.
Was anyone outside the Soviet Union aware of what was really going on?
Some information did get out. Applebaum mentions early press articles. Raymond Duguet wrote a book about Solovetsky back in 1927. So there was some awareness in certain circles in the West. It wasn't a total secret.
And wasn't there even like an attempt at a boycott?
Yeah, the American Federation of Labor actually supported a boycott of Soviet goods, specifically citing concerns about forced labor.
So the knowledge was there to some extent. Why wasn't there more outcry?
Well, Applebaum suggests a mix of reasons. Some ignorance, yes, but also political sympathies for the Soviet experiment, economic interests, maybe a reluctance to believe the scale of the brutality. It's complex.
Okay, moving on then, into the late 1930s. The Great Terror. This sounds like another major escalation.
A massive one. The terror wasn't just aimed outwards, it turned inwards with incredible ferocity. Mass arrests swept up huge numbers, not just ordinary people, but party loyalists, military leaders, even Gulag administrators themselves. People who had run the system were suddenly consumed by it.
Accused of what?
Often bizarre, fabricated conspiracies, right? Trotskyist plots, wrecking, sabotage, things that made no sense but were enough to condemn people.
And the term political prisoner itself changed meaning again.
Completely. It went from having maybe some minor residual privileges in the earliest days to being the worst label you could have, enemy of the people. And within the camps themselves, the level of arbitrary brutality just skyrocketed. Summary executions became much more frequent.
How were these sentences decided? Was there any process?
Often, no real legal process at all, especially within the camps. This is where the NKVD troikas come in. These were basically three-person NKVD panels that could sentence prisoners, including imposing the death penalty, completely outside the court system. No trial, no defense, just bureaucratic murder.
Terrifying. And then Beria takes over the NKVD. Did that change things?
Lavrenti Beria's appointment brought a shift, yes, but maybe not in the way you'd hope. His focus was ruthlessly on making the Gulag more economically productive. So there was an emphasis on, well, keeping prisoners alive enough to work. But it didn't mean better treatment in a humane sense. It was purely about efficiency.
And this is when the Shurashkis were set up.
Yes, these special secret labs within the Gulag system. Imprisoned scientists and engineers were forced to work on state projects, aviation, weaponry, cryptography, exploiting their brains even while they were prisoners.
So terror and exploitation hand in hand. And the number of prisoners just kept climbing.
Dramatically. The camp population swelled, and the whole administration of the Gulag became even bigger, more complex, more specialized.
But Applebaum emphasizes that most people still went through some kind of legal process first, right? However flawed.
Yes, that's an important point. It wasn't usually just people being snatched off the street and thrown directly into a camp without any paperwork. There was usually an arrest, an interrogation, often a trial, though these trials could be complete farces. The interrogations themselves relied heavily on psychological torture, sleep deprivation, threats against family, alongside physical abuse, all aimed at getting a confession.
And your fate depended on confessing.
To a large extent, yes. Cooperating, signing a confession, even to things you didn't do, might sometimes lead to a slightly better outcome, or at least ends the interrogation phase. It was a completely perverse system where truth was irrelevant.
Just utterly dehumanizing.
Completely. It stripped away any sense of justice or individual worth.
Okay, so the system is vast, brutal, economically driven, but also steeped in terror. Then comes World War II in the 1940s. How did that impact the Gulag?
The war made things even worse, if that's possible. Conditions deteriorated further because of nationwide shortages of food, medicine, everything. Death rates from starvation and disease climbed even higher. Overwork was rampant as the war effort demanded resources.
And what happened when the Germans advanced? Were camps evacuated?
They often were, but the evacuations themselves were frequently brutal. Applebaum documents instances where, as the front lines near, the NKVD simply massacred prisoners rather than move them. Just horrific incidents.
My God, and the war brought new groups of people into the camps too, didn't it?
Yes, huge new categories. Prisoners of war, obviously, from Axis countries, but also others. This includes the Polish officers who were murdered by the NKVD at Katyn, and other sites technically POWs before they were killed. And then there were massive deportations of entire populations from territories the Soviet Union annexed or occupied the Baltic states, parts of Poland, Ukraine. These are often labeled administrative deportations.
What did that mean, administrative deportation? Sounds bureaucratic for something awful.
It was. It was a way to forcibly remove and imprison huge groups of people deemed politically unreliable or potentially hostile, often without any individual charges or trials. Just rounded up and sent east, families torn apart. Applebaum notes that the Soviet leadership increasingly saw the labor extracted from these prisoners, especially POWs, as a form of war reparations. Payment in forced work.
Did they acknowledge having all these foreign prisoners?
Officially. Often not, or they downplayed it heavily. Propaganda continued, denial was common, especially regarding the conditions and treatment of foreigners.
So after the war, did the numbers go down?
No, the opposite. The post-war years actually saw another surge in the camp population and also in the numbers of those special exiles. The system just kept expanding.
But didn't some kind of resistance start to emerge within the camps around this time?
Yes, interestingly, Applebaum describes how organized resistance movements began to form, particularly among the political prisoners. They started to push back against the long-standing dominance of the criminal gangs who often terrorized other inmates.
How did the authorities react to that?
It led, in part, to the creation of the Osobe Lageria, the special camps. These were maximum security camps specifically designed to hold those considered the most dangerous political prisoners, often the ones involved in resistance or organizing. It was a way to isolate them.
So another layer of control, another division within the system.
Exactly. And alongside that, you had ongoing brutal conflicts within the broader camp population between different factions of the criminal underworld. There were the traditional thieves-in-law, the Vori Vizakon with their own strict codes, versus the so-called Suki, or bitches, criminals who collaborated with the camp administration. These bitch wars were incredibly violent.
What a complex, brutal internal world. Then Stalin dies in 1953. That must have sent shockwaves through the Gulag.
Absolutely. Applebaum describes an immediate, palpable reaction. Among prisoners and exiles, there was a sudden surge of hope, maybe unrealistic hope, for change, for release. Among the Gulag officials, though, there was fear, uncertainty about what would happen now that the architect of the system was gone.
And Beria, who had been running the security apparatus, he made some moves initially.
Yes, Beria briefly initiated some reforms, even suggesting amnesties, but his own political position was precarious, and he was quickly arrested and executed himself. His downfall sort of marked the real start of the post-Stalin thaw, however slow it was.
So releases did start happening. Amnesties.
Yes, amnesties began, but the way they were handled caused a lot of problems. As Applebaum points out, the early releases often prioritized common criminals over political prisoners.
That must have felt incredibly unjust to the politicals still inside.
Deeply frustrating and resentful. And even for those who were eventually released, the process of rehabilitation, getting their records cleared, was incredibly slow, bureaucratic, and often incomplete.
And going back home, reintegrating must have been so difficult.
Extremely challenging. Many faced suspicion, discrimination. Finding housing, finding work was hard. Society had often moved on or was afraid to associate with former Gulag inmates. It was often a traumatic homecoming.
Did the topic of the Gulag start to become, well, mentionable in Soviet society?
Slowly, tentatively. The big breakthrough, of course, was the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, during Khrushchev's thaw. That was huge, a crack in the official silence.
But the system didn't just vanish, did it? Even if the massive camps started shrinking.
No, it adapted. New types of political prisoners emerged in the later Soviet decades, dissidents fighting for human rights, refuseniks denied permission to emigrate, members of religious minorities.
And the methods of repression changed, too.
Yes. Alongside traditional prison sentences, the state increasingly used punitive psychiatry, locking dissidents up in psychiatric hospitals, diagnosing them with fictitious mental illnesses like sluggish schizophrenia. It was another way to silence dissent without the appearance of traditional political trials.
So conditions might have improved slightly from the absolute worst of Stalin's era, but it was still a repressive system.
Definitely. Applebaum shows that while the sheer scale decreased and maybe the most extreme random brutality lessened, poor conditions, mistreatment, and violations of rights absolutely persisted. But importantly, she also documents how prisoners continued to resist, to organize, to document abuses right up until the end. Activism continued even within the later camps and prisons.
And it took Gorbachev and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union to finally bring it to an end.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, led to the release of the remaining political prisoners in the late 1980s. The formal dismantling of the Gulag administration happened alongside the collapse of the USSR itself. A very long, very dark chapter finally closed. Officially closed, anyway. But as Applebaum argues so powerfully, the legacy, that's another story.
Right, let's talk about that legacy, because one of the striking points in the book is this lack of a full public reckoning with the Gulag in post-Soviet Russia. Why is that?
Applebaum digs into several complex, interconnected reasons. There's the deep-seated fear that decades of totalitarianism instills in a society, a reluctance to revisit trauma. There's also perhaps lingering guilt or complicity among parts of the population or their descendants. The fact that many former elites, people connected to the old system, retained positions of power and influence certainly didn't help encourage a full accounting. And there's also the way national historical narratives are constructed. In Russia, the focus has often been more on victory in World War II or other aspects of Soviet achievement, sometimes overshadowing or minimizing the internal repression.
It sounds like a very difficult, tangled knot to unpick.
It is. It's painful history, and confronting it fully is challenging for any nation, but the factors in Russia seem particularly complex.
It makes you think about why confronting this history is so important, even when it's hard.
Absolutely crucial. Applebaum argues, I think very convincingly, that understanding the Gulag is vital not just for understanding the past, but for understanding the present too. If you don't reckon honestly with how state power can be abused, how rights can be trampled, how ideologies can justify mass cruelty, then you risk repeating those patterns, or at least failing to recognize the warning signs. The lessons are stark.
So this deep dive into Anne Applebaum's Gulag has taken us through an immense, horrifying, but also, as you said, incredibly important history. It's a story of unimaginable state cruelty and suffering, but also woven through it these threads of human resilience, resistance, even culture.
Definitely. From those surprisingly complex early camps, through the sheer industrial horror of the Stalin era, the wartime traumas, and then the long, slow, uneven process of dismantling, Applebaum gives us this incredibly detailed, powerful, and necessary account. It's essential history for the 20th century.
Concluding thought for you, the listener. The history of the Gulag reveals not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Understanding this history is crucial for grappling with the legacies of totalitarianism and the ongoing struggles for human rights. What aspects of this deep dive resonate most with you? And what further questions does it spark about the relationship between state power and individual lives? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.